Hey everyone, welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Derling, and I am pleased to bring back someone who has been on the show before, Mr. Brian Heaton. He is a fellow author. I still feel weird referring to myself as an author, but I had Brian on a little while ago to talk about his most excellent Queensryche book, Roads to Madness, which is a great chronicle of that band's touring history from their formation all the way through 97. And Brian is a prolific writer. He's got two more books that we're going to talk about today. And the first one I'm going to mention does have a Queensryche connection. It is about the late Jason Slater, who worked with a variety of artists, but he came up on my radar working with Queensryche. I'm thinking sometime in the mid 2000s, but Brian can explain that. And Brian also has a book out, and I love this because it's the same thing. What drives you to write about certain subjects? It's about a band that did two albums in the late 80s and reunited many years later. Were never a big success, but are well loved by a cult following. So, being a fan of certainly a band like Y&T, I get that. So the band is Fifth Angel, and I'm pretty sure that Brian's got 100% of the Fifth Angel books on the market, which is awesome. Which is awesome. So Brian, welcome back to the show.
Tim, thanks very much for having me again, and congrats on all the books that you have out as well. I love them so far. Looking forward to reading Fleetwood, the one on Fleetwood Mac, and yeah, thanks for having me back. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Listen, Brian, I know as we're kind of doing the same thing. It's sometimes it's not the easiest thing to get the word out. You know that you've got product that there's an audience for. It's just a matter of reaching that audience. So yeah, if I can help anybody do that, I'm happy to do it. And I know it's going to be a good product based on the Roads to Madness book because the detail is there, the research is there. So there's obviously quite a passion for it. And I know your Jason Slater book has been out for a while, and because we talked about that after we did the episode on your Roads to Madness book. I keep wanting to say Building Empires. That's not right.
Well, that was the one before Roads to Madness that I was part of.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. So let's start out with that one because it is the older of the two. Talk to me about your Jason Slater book and your relationship with Jason and all of that because that was very tragic. He died a very, very young man. So let's talk about that book.
Yeah, Jason was a really good friend of mine. He came on my radar in the mid 2000s. In fact, my wife and I went to go see Queensryche play in Las Vegas in 2004. And at the time, it's funny, I write about this in the book. We get to the show and we're thinking we're going to get Symphony X as the opener for Queensryche because they had been on that tour. And we roll in, like, who's this band, Snake River Conspiracy? We had never heard of these guys. And as we're listening, we're watching, and how later on we find out it's Jason on bass, and he's got a lot of energy, he's got a lot of groove, and I started finding out that he was going to be part of Operation Mindcrime 2 a couple months later, so I emailed him and just said, hey, can we do an interview? I usually write about Queensryche. I'd love to talk and document the Mindcrime 2 process, and we hit it off. And for 15 years we were the closest of friends. It was he lived in the Bay Area and I live in the Sacramento region, and we of California, and we got together regularly. I went down to the studio, and fun fact, I was the first person outside of the band or the record label to hear Operation Mindcrime 2 live. Not live, to hear the record.
Like the
um,
playback of it.
yeah, the playback of it, because I was in the studio probably a day and a half after they sent it off to the label. Um, so it was we just developed a great friendship over 15 years, and he became family to my wife Stacy and I and our daughter. And yeah, we planned to write this book when his career was over, and he kind of finished up working, I would say 2011, 2013, probably 2013ish, 2014ish, and he got sick. And so even though he wrote a lot of notes and I had a whole bunch of stuff together, as he went and got more seriously ill in 2020, he just said, hey Brian, write the book, don't worry what happens to me, go ahead and write the book. We talked about doing this, and I was happy to do it. And Jason Slater, for the sake of supposing, is the name of the book. And It's Tim, I got to tell you, this was like the most different type of book I've ever tried to write. It's since we were Jason and I were supposed to do this together, we ended up I needed to make sure that he was a big part of the vibe of the book, of the tone of the book. I wanted people to kind of not just hear my style of writing, but hear it as Jason would tell things. So what I did was I wrote the narrative, and then I went back and I pulled a lot of his very long-winded, funny stories, and I put them at the back of the chapters so that as you're reading the narrative and you get to a certain point, you're done with the chapter, and then Jason takes over for like 2, 3 pages and tells funny stories, interesting stories, goes into detail about certain situations. And there was a person who reviewed it, and I, for the life of me, of course, I'm forgetting now when you're talking to me, but she referred to the book as kind of like a diary of someone with a narrative that goes along with it. I wish I could be more accurate in that description, but the way the book is meant to be read is you read it cover to cover, but Jason floats in and out his actual words. And it was an interesting process of putting those things together to have a cohesive story and narrative.
That must have been, I mean, goes without saying, but that must have been emotional for you to go back and revisit. And that's not just, you're not just writing about a musician, you're writing about your friend who's
Yeah.
no longer here. And you're using, I'm sure that you're what are you typing out or whatever, you're hearing it, his voice and his inflections and the way that he would say things.
Yeah, he passed away in December of 2020, and it took me 4 years before I was really comfortable to write. I did Roads to Madness and Building an Empire and did those beforehand. And when we got to about, I would say the middle of 2000 of 2024, I said, okay, I can handle this, and talked to his ex-wife, who he was still best friends with, and talked to his daughter, and they were both like, yes, please, we were happy to do that, and they were instrumental. Alyssa Carlson is his daughter, and then they were instrumental, um, his ex-wife and Alyssa, in putting together some of the stories, some of the anecdotes from Jason, some of the pictures that are in there are stuff that Alyssa had given to me and said, yes, please use this. So it was very emotional. There was a lot of tears involved. When I say he was family, that's not me just using that word lightly. Jason, my wife and I were with Jason in the hard times and in the good times. And this was just something that I wanted to make sure people didn't forget the colorful person and funny person that he was. Um, he was a brilliant musician, shot himself in the foot a bunch of times when in some of his projects. And as you read the book, you'll find out about some of those. But everything from pop and, I would say pop and hip hop and heavy metal, he had his fingers in everything. And it was he was quite a genius in his own way. And if you didn't know him, he was one of those people that didn't want you to see how he did what he did. And there's this great story about when he was working with Third Eye Blind. He was the original bass player with Third Eye Blind, and he had left the band right as they signed their record deal. He didn't like the singer Stephen Jenkins from Third Eye Blind. They didn't get along, and Stephen wanted to work with Jason to produce the record, and Jason was like, no, and he handed it off to a friend of his who ended up becoming a very famous producer. And it was just lots of cool stories like that and situations. It was a lot of fun to write. It was a lot of emotion when I was writing it, but I was glad to get it done and fulfill the promise I made to him.
So I have to ask the title of it, For the Sake of Supposing. Where does that come from? Is that something he would say?
Yes.
That's
He
what I kind of figured. That's too specific to just be there for no reason.
Well, I put this whole quote in the book toward the end of the book, and I can't remember it exactly verbatim right here, but it starts out, let's just suppose, for the sake of supposing, I die and I leave all of these unfinished songs and all this crappy stuff that I worked on he goes, I can't have that. So I've been slowly deleting every crappy song that I ever wrote. And in the context of the book as you read it, you'll laugh. It's pulled right from Jason, and it
Yeah.
it kind of encapsulates his sense of humor.
So for the record, and I know, like, just from an outsider's point of view, as somebody that had been following Queensryche and continued to follow Queensryche, fans will say that opinions are divided on Operation Mindcrime 2. I happen to really like it, and I happen to think that it captures the spirit of the original, which is almost impossible. Like it's almost impossible to it sounds like another batch of songs that were just recorded in 1987, 1988. Now, and then I won't ask you for specifics, but there are rumors about who actually plays on the album. And so where I'm going with this is, like, oftentimes you'd always read these, blabbermouth articles or whatever, and inevitably Jason's name would come up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like Jason became, well, who's this guy? Who's this guy? Like, so, you know, eh, what would you say to those types of fans to say, look, Jason was a hard worker and he happened to be involved with a band that at, like during a very volatile few years for them, right?
I don't mind talking about the detail about this at all, but it's a very long story, so I'll try to be as brief with this. When Jason and Queensryche first got together, Queensryche was in trouble. They had come off Tribe, which people don't know that. And then when they got together with Jason and they finally decided to do Mindcrime 2, which, in my opinion, and as Jason has told me, he shared his opinion, the reason why they were doing that was because they needed the money. Mindcrime 2 got them a very good advance from Rhino Records. It got them on the road for many years. It was a big deal. And so you talk about the people that played on the record and all those fine details. People don't understand. Jason just didn't produce Operation Mindcrime 2. He wrote 90% of the music and played probably three-quarters of the bass. Um, and that's not a shot at Eddie Jackson, who's a good friend and a great bass player. But Jason's a complete songwriter. He would write demos that were almost complete. He had his own studio. And it wasn't just a laptop in his house. He had his own studio. So what people need to understand about Operation Mindcrime 2 was it was an album that needed to get made in order for the band to continue on and to pay and to give the band and keep the band afloat. They needed that name recognition of Mindcrime 2. And the record never would have been completed had Jason not written it. When he was hired, Tim, Jason was hired to be the producer. He didn't want to write all the songs. He got together with the band and said, what do you have? And they didn't have anything other than a little bit of Hostage, which was one of the songs on there that they had to modify a bit, and a couple of other riffs. But the rest of it, Jason had to write, otherwise the record wouldn't get done. And I think Queensryche fans who I don't want to say I don't want to say they criticize it, but some do. But I don't think Queensryche fans quite understand. Like, you might not have had a band had it
Yeah,
not been for Jason stepping in and writing those songs. And
yeah.
I don't think people understand that. And so this book talks a lot about the process of creating that record and the records that came after that. One thing people really need to understand about Jason was a Queensryche fan. One of his first records was the EP that he bought with his own money. Gigantic Queensryche fan. And all he wanted to do was to deliver the fans a record that felt like Queensryche again, the old school Queensryche. And to be honest with you, Tim, I feel like for the most part, he succeeded.
Oh, listen, I mean, so this is really cool because this dovetails the end of Roads to Madness, because I happen to really like Here in the Now Frontier, but it tanked. The record
Yeah.
label went out of business. DeGarmo left, like the songwriting heartbeat of Queensryche left, and then they did Q2K, which it was all right, but there was missing something.
Right.
And then yeah, they did Tribe, which was very different. They're down to Sanctuary Records. They're not on a major label anymore. So that actually makes a lot of sense. I guess I didn't really think about it, but I remember thinking when it was announced, Mindcrime 2, that is, was not even an anniversary. It's 18 years. It's an
Yeah.
awkward, but that makes sense because Rhino understood that there was marketability behind it, not just calling it Operation Mindcrime 2, having the artwork that harkens back to the first album. And you're right. I mean, because they went on tour and they were able to do both of those albums. Then they did Mindcrime at the Moor, which is really good. They did the covers album. So yeah, that's really fascinating um, that there was a strategic reason. It didn't just happen for no reason in 2006 or 2005 when it was under
Yeah.
being prepared. But
2006 it came out.
but
Yeah.
but but wow! I mean, I can tell that he's a Queensryche fan. Those songs sound like Queensryche songs. I think the first thing I heard off that album was The Hands,
Yeah.
and I was like, wow, that I haven't heard Queensryche sound that good in a long time.
And
Um,
to give him credit, that was Michael Wilton's riff in the Hands. That was one of the few riffs that they had. I think the riff in Murderer and the riff in the Hands were both Michael Wilton's, and Jason took those and put them in arrangements and put them into songs. And actually, the book kind of goes into depth about Jason's songwriting process and some of the strengths and weaknesses of some of the guys in Queensryche and how they crafted songs. And that was one of the things that I think that kind of got illuminated for Queensryche fans. Jason wrote complete songs. Like he would, from riff to arrangement to everything, he would give these complete demos over to Jeff, and Jeff would then sing something over it. Michael writes a little different. At least he did back then. I don't know how Michael writes now, but Michael would come up with riffs, but and maybe a couple progressions, but they were kind of more like song seeds. And I
mm,
and I think when you know that, and then you go back and you look at past Queensryche records, Kelly Gray kind of filled that DeGarmo role. Jason Slater kind of filled that DeGarmo role, where you take these ideas and you flesh them out and you provide full songs to connect with Jeff. Because Jeff can't really, he's not a musician, other than dabbling in keyboards, Jeff's not going to write a song on guitar. And so he kind of needs a more firmer structure to work from.
he
And that's
never
one
he
of the
never
things that
writes.
Jason said.
He
Yeah.
doesn't write riffs on the saxophone.
No. But yeah, it's that was one of the things that Jason really wanted to
So
have not cleared up, but he definitely wanted to talk about a little bit was the songwriting process of all the records he was involved with Queensryche. And that was, Mindcrime 2, Take Cover, American Soldier, and Dedicated to Chaos. Jason's songwriting, that was a major part of all of those records. Um, in fact, by the time you got to Dedicated to Chaos, it's almost kind of funny that that record is usually, panned by everyone as not being that great. And Jason laughed. He said by that point, Jeff was pulling off old demos that Jason had wrote 15 years prior that he thought were awful, that he wasn't going to do anything with. But Jeff ended up liking them. And so they ended up becoming songs.
yeah, I'll be honest with you. I don't like Dedicated to
Oh, I
Chaos
don't
that
either.
much. Yeah, I think that there are let me see if I'm counting all the bonus. If we count the four bonus songs, what is there? 15 songs.
Something like that. Yeah.
I think At the Edge is good, and
Yep.
I think a couple others, but man, there's some horrific stuff on there. Now, on the other hand, and I'm pretty sure Jason was still involved in this. I really liked Frequency Unknown
Yeah.
as much as I remember that was such a unique time because honest to God, I liked Frequency Unknown and I liked the self-titled album, and I was
Hmm.
so tickled that there were two Queensryche, completely different Queensryche bands putting out albums the same year. But I listened to both of those all the time. But I mean, Frequency Unknown came out first, and there was a lot of issues. People were complaining about the production, but I was like, man, there's some good songs on here. Like this is better than the past few Queensryche albums. It's debatable how Queensryche it is with all the guest stars, but um, I'm, Jason, he's pictured on there. So did he have a lot to do with that?
Yeah, he
That
did.
must have been quite the process to navigate.
He was Jason. He wrote most of the songs in there. There's a couple of I think Randy Gain, Random Damage from the who used to tour on the Rage for Order tour with Queensryche behind the curtain, a keyboard player. Um, Randy wrote one song. There were a couple of guest writers on a couple other songs, but most of those songs were Jason's. And
Yeah,
Jason would the thing about that was he was actually having major surgeries done during the whole recording process of that record. He was having a lot of medical issues, and so he would, come back from a treatment, get right back in the studio and start recording all this stuff. And one of his good friends and my friend as well, Craig LaCicero, who's the guitar player from the thrash metal band Forbidden. Craig
right.
played guitar throughout that record, all the rhythm tracks and all the little not the exact solos, but all the little lead parts that you hear throughout. Those are all Craig, and the two of them sat together and put together all of that record. And I agree with you. There are songs on there that I went back and I listened to, and I was like, "Hey, these are really good songs." And as for the production, it was rushed. I mean, that record was rushed,
Yeah,
and that was. If I have to bring up a something that would be a great every record that Jason worked on with them, for whatever reason, it was always rushed. Mindcrime 2, he was rushed because he was told that there was a particular deadline, and he found out from the label that the deadline was actually 2 weeks later. Susan Tate wanted the record early. Those type things happened all the time during Jason's tenure with Queensryche. And it was like he was trying to finish things and not being given exact dates and not having all the facts. And I mean, again, this is from Jason's perspective, right? So there's obviously um, other perspectives on things, but for the most part, yeah, I mean, he was heavily involved in everything that he did with those guys, right down to the Take Cover record, which was a covers record. All those arrangements are mostly Jason. You know, they weren't Michael or Stone or Mike Stone or anybody. Those were Jason's.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, among other things, that this book, again, it is one person's perspective, but it fills in a lot of the blanks in a very sort of confusing period for Queensryche. Like, I'm going to say like a good decade. Like if we start with Tribe and go to Frequency Unknown, um, and Jason was there for
All
not
of it.
Tribe,
So, well, right afterward.
but all of that, and he must have been privy to some sensitive goings on, to say the least.
He was, and the book is structured so it's like a typical biography. You get Jason's early years, his family life, the details about how he started his career in music and his production deal with Warner Brothers and some of the other bands that he was a part of. He was a part of a band called Snake River Conspiracy. They didn't really go anywhere, but they opened for a Perfect Circle back in 2000. They were talked about a lot. They got a lot of press early. He was part of a couple projects with Troy Van Leeuwen from the Queens of the Stone Age. A lot of that stuff in the late 90s and early 2000s, Jason was a part of. And having that production deal with Warner Brothers was really a big deal. He ended up, connecting with a lot of different people in the industry through that. And this book basically tells about that whole first part of his career. And then the second half of the book talks about the end part of his career, which was when he started with Queensryche through his passing in 2020. So it kind of gives it's funny. Some of the feedback that I got was, I feel like there's two different stories here. I'm like, well, you're a Queensryche fan. So the beginning part of the story of the book, yeah, if you're not into hip hop and you're not into, kind of that late 90s alternative metal
Yeah.
scene.
Yeah.
Some of this information
Post
might be,
grunge,
yeah,
right?
post grunge. You might, if you're not appreciating Jason as if you're not looking for a biography and you're just looking for Queensryche, the second half of the book is what you're really interested in. But if you read the whole thing, it really tells a story about a guy who was, supremely talented, who came from nothing and ended up making quite a career for himself. And it just, unfortunately, some bad decisions on his part and some bad luck led to, his, the end of his career, and unfortunately his passing way too early at the age of 49
Yeah.
in 2020.
Yeah, I remember, hearing about his passing and you know, being into a lot of classic bands, a lot of like, heritage acts, I guess they're called now.
Yeah.
You kind of expect you're going to hear about it. You don't expect somebody that young. Like you just you don't think you're like, wow, that seems wow. He was just a few years older than I am. And it's interesting what you bring up as far as this is a good way of answering that about it being two different uh, stories is like, well, you started reading the press about Jason Slater working with Queensryche, and I think probably a lot of people were like, well, who the F is Jason Slater?
That's what I
Well,
said.
this is who he is. This is who he is, and this is how he got himself into a position to be working with a band of Queensryche stature. So no one just appears working with Queensryche. It doesn't matter how talented you are. You've got to make a name for yourself. Otherwise, they're not going to contact you. You're not going to get in contact with them because who is this guy? They've got to, make those connections behind the scenes. A comparison that I'll make, it's not quite the same, but it goes to your point about, Queensryche fans wanting Queensryche content and nothing but in this book, and that's obviously not all they're going to get. Um, Greg Renoff, who is a
Yeah.
buddy of mine, he wrote Van Halen Rising, and he wrote the
Love that
excellent,
book. Yeah.
yeah, the well, he basically transcribed it because he interviewed Ted Templeman and did his autobiography. Now, if somebody buys that autobiography of Ted Templeman and all they want to read about is Van Halen, you're going to get lots of Van Halen content. But before you get there, you're going to hear an awful lot about Harper's Bazaar and
Hmm.
Little Feat and the Doobie Brothers and Carly Simon and Van Morrison. Like you've got to read through all that long before he started working with the Van Halen guys. So even before he started working with Sammy Hagar and Montrose, there's a lot up to that. But it all builds part of it. The story wouldn't be complete if somebody just appeared on the scene because even in movies and TV shows, a character will appear, you're kind of going along with it, and then sooner or later they decide to do their backstory. It's like, well, how did this come to be? Well, you're just giving it to them all at once.
Yeah, and that's a great comparison. It's exactly that. You get the whole backstory about why they would want to work with a guy that Jason Slater nobody has heard of. Well, a lot of people didn't hear about him, but you know how like Empire, the record, Queensryche's Empire, a lot of the times, a lot of engineers would use Empire to test studios to see the sound quality of particular studios. Well, Jason's record from his band called Snake River Conspiracy, it's called Sonic Jihad, and that was their one lone record. That had a similar reputation in the industry because sonically it was a really well produced and well engineered record, very well mixed. And I know Jason told me that he had given Sonic Jihad to the Tates to listen to for those Sonics. And I think that's probably what led them to
You,
hiring him
you,
because
you
I'm not a huge fan of the music, but sonically it was a really interesting record.
that's all. I always find that fascinating when you can listen to something not for the music and listen to it for but listen how well that's mixed.
Yeah.
I don't like the music, but listen to how well it sounds. And that's it, that's so true. Like maybe fans don't know who he is, but if you're in the industry and they know who you are, that's the fans will know who you are.
And if people read the book, you'll a lot of those stories, a lot of those connections with maybe some of those more high profile names. Jason told those stories, and that's what's really in the front part of the book before you get to the stuff with Queensryche it's, his connections. There's stories in there about having brunch with Ozzy Osbourne, and all things like meeting Don Dokken and going for a drive in Hollywood with Don Dokken. And I'm name dropping here, but these are all things that he talks about, and it was part and parcel to him getting that production deal with Warner Brothers Records, and that opens doors, and you
Yeah.
start meeting people, and some great stories. And you combine that with being a very talented engineer and producer. It doesn't surprise me at all that the Tates kind of fell in love with his gregarious nature, and then his record of the his production reel, and the things that he was a part of.
Yeah, totally. So, for the sake of supposing, it's all about Jason Slater's career. And where's the best place for folks to find that book?
You can just jump on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any of the major booksellers can order it. It usually pops up here and there, but yeah, Amazon's probably fine.
Okay. So let's move on. Let's move on to your latest book uh, about Fifth Angel of all
Yeah.
bands. It was Wings of Destiny.
Yes, Wings of
Yeah.
Destiny and the
Yeah.
story of Fifth Angel. Yeah.
Now, if my buddy Mike Stackhouse is watching this, I imagine he'll probably be interested in this book because he's the only guy I ever knew that was way into Fifth Angel. I met Mike in the early '90s. We were taking radio broadcasting, and I remember as somebody that grew up reading Circus and Hit Parader, seeing Ted Pilot in ads for vocal coaching,
Yes. Yeah.
not for selling an album or anything. So that's where that name first came up on my radar. So yeah, Fifth Angel. So tell me a little bit about them because they weren't they were sort of from the same neck of the woods as Queensryche, right? They were from Washington State.
They were. There was some connection there, and it was funny because I remember telling my wife after I finished Roads to Madness and Jason's book, I'm like, I got to get away from Queensryche for a little while and do some other things. And she's like, well, you should probably do the Fifth Angel book. And then as I was thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, but the whole like first part of the introduction, they're so connected. They for instance, Fifth Angel, when they were there was a band called Ridge in Seattle, in Bellevue, where Queensryche, the mob, where they were all from, and they were in these battle of the bands back in the late '70s and early '80s. And there was this band Ridge, which had Ted Pilot, who eventually was in Fifth Angel, Ed Archer, who was eventually in Fifth Angel, and Ken Mary, again eventually in Fifth Angel. They went up against Tyrant, which was the band, one of the bands that Jeff Tate was in before Queensryche. And so there's these connections of, Ridge never really went anywhere, and Tyrant and Joker, those bands never really went anywhere. Queensryche ended up getting a record deal, and then right after Queensryche got a record deal, a few years later, Fifth Angel had formed, and then they got a record deal first with an independent label with Shrapnel, and
Hmm.
then eventually the big deal with Epic Records.
Yeah, so the first Fifth Angel came out in '86 on
Mm-hmm.
Shrapnel, and then they did Time Will Tell in it came out in
89.
'89 on Epic, produced by Terry Brown.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
there's a major, any Rush fans will perk up when they hear the name Terry Brown.
Yeah.
And it must have, I mean, obviously that was it for a long time for albums, but somebody at Epic must have had faith in this band because then they reissued the first album, which doesn't always happen with these bands. So,
Yeah.
so basically, like, what's your history as a fan with Fifth Angel, and what led you to dedicating a book to them? I think it's amazing that you did.
Well, thank you. I was a fan like anybody. 87, 88, I found out about them. It's kind of the same way I found out about Queensryche. A couple friends from when we were teenagers, their older brother came home with this tape one day and says, check this out. It's a band, Fifth Angel. Popped it in the boom box that we had in the bedroom, and all of a sudden the song In the Fallout from their first record comes on. I'm like, wow, who is this? And the lyrics were more serious on that first record. They were, it wasn't, you remember, this is the era of 1988. It's the era of, pop metal and hair metal stuff. And that stuff has its place. And we were listening to some of that. But then Fifth Angel was talking about nuclear holocaust and all these serious kind of topics. And the music was just, you know, I had discovered um I had discovered Queensryche, but Fifth Angel, that, especially that first record, it was very, the guitar playing was very neoclassical in style, which I didn't know what that meant until later on. But now when I listen back to it, it's just like it's not necessarily blues based. There's a lot of really technical things going on in the lead playing, but you have this great rhythm section with Ken Mary leading the charge on the drums, and a vocalist in Ted Pilot who maybe doesn't hit the stratosphere like Jeff Tate, but such a powerful
Mm.
Dio-esque, Don Dokken-esque type voice. And it just
It was a commanding
commanding.
voice.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And it just struck me. And when I was going through the liner notes, I was like, look at this. They're from the Seattle area too. I'm like, oh, this is funny. And so I just became a big fan, like any kid who was 13, 14 at the time, whatever it was. And through the years, I just started following them, picked up their second record, and then they went away. And I tell a little bit of that story in the book, but I ended up, if you fast forward to 99 or so, I was online and I was, surfing the web and doing something one day, and I was listening to Fifth Angel, and I found their lead guitarist from their first record, James Bird. I found his website and I contacted him and he wrote me back, and I was on cloud nine. I was like, oh, this is so cool. Struck up a friendship with him, built a website about Fifth Angel in the early 2000s. And then the rest of the band realized what I had done and they got in touch with me and we became friends. And eventually, over time, when they reunited in 2000, what was it, 2010? Because they played the Keep It True festival in I think it was 2009, 2010. Um, yeah, they reunited then, and I was a big part of that. I was helping them out with all their media relations stuff, the early days of Blabbermouth, and when you issue press releases, they pick them up and all that kind of good stuff. So I have a bit of history with them, and that friendship has continued now for 15 more years. And I always told Ed Archer, the rhythm guitar player in Fifth Angel, I said one day I'm going to write a book about this band, and it was just time. They had more of a story, and that big deal they did with Epic Records, and then they signed with Nuclear Blast several years ago now, and did two more records. So it was just time, and I was so happy to be able to write the book and bring that band to light for some people that might not have known about them the first time.
Um, well, I mean, the fact that they were on Shrapnel for that first album
Mm-hmm.
tells me that obviously there was some serious guitar chop because Mike Varney he didn't sign anyone that, you had to be Yngwie or Paul Gilbert
Yes.
or Cacophony or, Jason Becker, Marty Friedman. So obviously there was some serious guitar chops there. It is interesting because it is a band that could have had more of a commercial feel because they were definitely melodic. I
Yeah,
mean, they definitely
for
had
sure.
melody, and they did a really good cover of UFO's "Lights Out." So, was that a band? Okay, let me ask you this: Was there going to be another? Was there going to be a third album, another epic album, or was that just a one and done thing?
They at that point, and we're looking at 1990, early 1990 at that point. Epic did want another record, but the band also wanted to work Time Will Tell a little bit because it had only been out for that was out in August of '89, and so by the time they got to about January 1990, the video for Time Will Tell came out. The record was still doing pretty good, but they couldn't get on a tour, and the record label was getting frustrated and they were getting frustrated and they wanted them to go back and do a third record. And Fifth Angel was like, we don't want to get back in right away, we want to work this. Unfortunately, the tour never happened. They had some tour dates planned, and it just didn't make sense. And that band actually never played a live public gig ever in its first iteration. They never did. They didn't play live until 2010 in Germany. That was the first time.
Not even club dates or anything?
Nothing. They had them booked,
Wow.
but they never played them. And they ended up canceling them, and then they broke up in like February, March of 1990. And but yeah, they never played live. The only time they played live for anyone was Bob Feinangle, who was um, part of Epic Records at the time, in charge of signing bands and managing different things with them. He saw them play in, I believe it was James Bird's basement or Ted Pilot's basement. Saw him do a set, half-hour set, just to prove that they could actually play the material from that first record live, and he was blown away.
Yeah.
And that's how they got signed to Epic off of Shrapnel. But they never played live until 2010.
I don't think I've ever heard a story quite like that. I've heard tell of bands unable to land a big tour, and that has been a detriment to a lot of bands that just the bands that would make sense for them to be opening for are either already on the road or they're in the studio and they're not on the road at all. And there was just a lot of competition. And
Yeah,
also, what's interesting is that anytime I talk to someone about a band that didn't quite make it and you get anywhere close to the 90s, the dreaded grunge word always comes up, but that has nothing to do with it. It was just circumstances. Um,
it was funny. I mean, they were in the running to open for Ozzy Osbourne on the No Rest for the Wicked tour.
that would make sense because he was on
Yeah,
Epic.
that was the first record for Zach Wild.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a great picture in there of Ted Pilot with Zach Wild before he started growing all of his facial hair out.
Right, right.
It's like baby Zach Wild and Ted
Yeah.
Pilot in this photo. But yeah, they were in the running for that tour and they just didn't get it. They were in the running for the guys said that they were up for a tour with the Scorpions, and that never panned out. I'm not quite sure which tour that was, and they couldn't remember either. But the Ozzy one was definitely on the plate, and they I think Anthrax, Vixen, and somebody else ended up doing that tour with Ozzy. So
Nothing against Vixen, but Fifth Angel would have been a much more
I
apt.
like Vixen, but
Yeah,
yeah,
but
I
yeah,
think
for
Fifth Angel would be
Vixen would have
better.
been better off opening for Poison or you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
um, but yeah, I mean, look at the track record of bands that open for Ozzy. You know, Metallica happens to
Yeah.
come to mind. I mean, it's been a great springboard for if you know, it's been a great springboard for opening bands and also lead guitarists.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
yeah, that's really interesting, and that the fact that they never even did like local club shows that blows my mind because it's like,
Well,
but they were such
I,
a functional like it sounds like they'd been woodshedding for years, but I guess it was just behind the scenes.
well, that was the thing when they formed Fifth Angel, and this gets told in the beginning part of the book. James Bird really had this vision, the lead guitar player for the band that he wanted to create with Ted Pilot, because he had heard about James Bird was living in LA at the time, gigging around with some bands, and he moved back to Seattle because he had heard about Ted Pilot and wanted to work with him. And one of the things that James really wanted was a band that followed the model that Queensryche did. Really work on your songs, get an album's worth of songs that are great and you're ready to go, and don't tour the clubs and play that scene. Because there's been a history of a lot of bands in Seattle. Rail comes to mind. Rail
Hmm.
was a great band up in Seattle. They burned themselves out. They played hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shows in the 70s and burned themselves out before they ever really went anywhere. And James didn't want to do that. He didn't want to get messed up in the club scene with Fifth Angel. And so that was really what started the band's, I don't want to say it, their mantra, but they wanted to have a great record before they played. And
So it was by design.
so it was by design in the beginning. And
Yeah.
then by the time they got to Time Will Tell, they were like,
Okay, we're
well,
ready now.
we're ready. We want to play. And they just
Yeah.
never could get on there.
Mhm. So, yeah, okay. So then obviously, as far as musicianship in that band, we need to talk about Ken Mary. I mean,
Yeah.
his biggest profile gig was Alice Cooper. I think he
Yeah.
did the Raise Your Fist and Yell
He
album, if not tour. Maybe did he do Constrictor too? It was that MCA era anyway.
Yeah, it was that era. He was also on a live record by Alice Cooper at the time too. That it's getting, I can't remember off the top of my head, but the live record that Alice put out probably in 87, 88 ish. Um, he's on that too. Ken Mary, talk about a talented guy. Everybody
Was
who
it?
I
Didn't he
talked
play
to,
on the first House of Lords album, or am I getting
yes,
that mixed up?
yes, he
Yeah, that's
did.
what I was like. Am I getting him
Yep.
mixed up with somebody else? Because, um, yeah, great, great drummer. I mean, no wonder he was in demand.
Yeah, he had it's funny. He was the youngest member of the band by a few years. And even when Fifth Angel was recruiting let me step back. When Ridge, the cover band with Ted Pilot and Ed Archer, they were looking for a drummer, and this we're in the '70s now. They they got tipped off to this drummer that was barely in junior high school, and that was Ken Merritt, and he was
Yeah.
great even as like a 14-year-old. He was amazing, and so he was really in demand. He played with he played. I want to say he played on a was it TKO album. He played with Randy Hansen up in Seattle, who was a Hendrix impersonator,
Right.
and he
Yeah.
had his band.
Yeah.
He
And
went with
TKO
Alice
is from
Cooper, Seattle. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, that's so
yep.
that makes sense. Yeah.
So yeah, he was really in demand, and then all of a sudden, like as he was on the road with Alice Cooper, then lots of offers of doing different things came his way, and he's on so many records. He laughed when I interviewed him. He's like, I've lost track of how many records I'm on, because he did a lot of stuff, and that was actually when he ended up leaving Fifth Angel prior to Time Will Tell. He ended up flying in to help the band out and recorded the drum tracks for that record, but he wasn't even in the band at the time, because he was so in demand. He's like, look, guys, I can't do this. I've got too many other things that I'm doing.
Yeah.
But man, talk about a underrated guy. If you're a hard rock and a metal fan, you probably know who Ken Mary is, but he is so talented. He's such a showman, uh, and a hell of a nice guy. Really
Yeah.
good guy.
So, other than just, the frustration of not getting any further after Time Will Tell, why was there such a big gap between them playing and then eventually recording some more music?
Um, the gap between Time Will Tell and when they got back together and then another record, yeah, it was a combination of things. When they broke up, it's such bad timing. Do you remember Howard Stern's television show from the early 1990? Um,
Yes, I read about this. He used one
okay,
of their songs.
yeah. Well, the funny thing was, Fifth Angel broke up in about the spring of 1990, and Howard ended up using Midnight Love, their track from Time Will Tell, as the intro music for his show throughout its year and a half, 2 year run. Well, that would have done wonders for Fifth Angel in terms of marketing, but they
If
didn't
the,
exist
yeah,
anymore.
if they'd have shot a video for that, then people could have put
Right.
it together like, oh, that's that song.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean
It
Howard. I mean he was it Enough's Enough. Howard was a big champion of those guys. So
yeah. Yeah, he was big. And so Fifth Angel just they went their separate ways. Ted Pilot became a dentist, and
wow,
he had to make a choice. He was either going to continue with Fifth Angel or he had to do his national board exams for dentistry, and he chose that. And Ed Archer had a career already in the electronics field, and he was approaching 30, and he was like, "Hey, I gotta do something with my life." And so they all went their separate ways, and they got a call from or an email from Oliver Weissenheimer. And my apologies if I mispronounced the last name, but he's the promoter of Keep It True, a festival in Germany. And he said, "Hey, I'd like to have Fifth Angel perform." And this was in 2009. And the guys were all ready to get back together. And they were, they had started playing and on their own. And a couple of the members, Kendall Bechtel, who took over for James Bird, he's dabbled and been playing that whole time anyway. So he was pretty practiced up, but the rest of them hadn't. Ed Archer hadn't played in 20 years, and John Macco hadn't played in a while either. And so they got together and decided to go ahead and play that show. And there was a lot of ups and downs because Ted Pilot couldn't join them. So they went through a few singers
wow.
before they found Peter Arulian, who did that show with them. And yeah, and that started their whole reunion period. And yeah, they've been going strong ever since.
So if you had to describe Fifth Angel to a curious like newcomer, what say, well, if you like X band, X band, X band, you'd probably like Fifth Angel. Who would you put in the sort of in their ballpark?
I would say Fifth Angel, if you like Judas Priest, the Scorpions, um, and Dokken, that's the three bands and Dio. If you like those four artists, you'd probably like Fifth Angel. The first record's a little faster, a little heavier, a little more neoclassical Yngwie type of lead guitar style, but the songs are in the ballpark of Priest and all that, um, like Priest and Maiden and the Scorpions, because they have a melodic edge too. So that's how I would do it. I always thought that Ted Pilot and Ted Pilot in particular, and Kendall Bechtel, who sang on their third record, they have a Dio quality to their voices too. Ted Pilot also has a bit of a Don Dokken vibe to his voice.
Yeah, yeah. Like
So
If Dokken, it's almost like if Dokken was a little more goth, just a little,
yeah, just a
like
little.
just a little hint. Because when I think of a song like "Cry Out the Fools," I can
Yeah,
hear Don Dokken singing that.
absolutely,
It's
absolutely.
dramatic. It's dramatic.
Don Dokken, straight out of 1987, would kill that song
Don Dokken at his
at
peak
his
of
peak.
his power.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's weird. I think most of us, like, huge music heads that have these huge music collections, is we've all got we've all got bands that we think, the ones that got away as far as fame. I mean, obviously with me, it's Y&T.
Yeah.
But there's other bands like Coney Hatch and there's tons of bands that are like, man, these guys had potential to hit really big.
King's
Um,
X, that's another one.
yeah. What
Yeah.
is it? What is it about Fifth Angel that you think was the reason possibly they didn't go any further, or do you think maybe they were one album away from hitting, because it was possible at that point they could have had a record out in '91 that broke before grunge hit, or do you think it was just they were just destined to be a band with a rabid cult following?
They they have talked about this. By they, I mean Ed Archer and Ken Mary had a conversation about this not too long ago, and I talked to Ed about this a bit. It's they believe, and by they I mean Ed and Ken, that they were a little bit too smart for their own good in the 80s. As I said, Ted had another career planned in dentistry. Ed had a career planned. It was the success stories are the ones like Guns N' Roses. You don't have a plan B. You just
Right.
literally live in the gutter, and all of a sudden you make it.
Yep.
Those seem to be the bands that really made it. Like there was no plan B. Fifth Angel, the guys always had a plan B, and I think that held them back from taking some bigger risks. The tour dates, the club dates that I told you about that they had planned for early 1990. Well, those dates were planned. They weren't. I know the reasons why they didn't do them, because back then you would play 3 nights in a row, have a day off, play another 2 nights in a row, have a day off, play 4 nights in a row. That wasn't how that tour was staggered for Fifth Angel. It was more like play one night, have 3 nights off, then play 2 nights, have 4 nights off. So
It wouldn't. It wasn't. No, it wasn't feasible.
it wasn't feasible. But other bands, like say if it was Guns N' Roses from back in the day, they would have just did it, or Skid Row, they would have just did it.
Did it, and hopefully while they're out there,
Yeah,
hop on to another tour.
exactly.
But
And
if
Fifth
you're out
Angel
there
just didn't do
playing and you've got your chops up, at least you'd be ready if, well, not Doc would be a bad example, but
right.
you know what I
But
mean? Like, or even like a mid-tier band that was playing theaters or something, like a King's X, um, somebody like that, they could have at least, it would have been another step forward, because I mean,
absolutely.
they
Yeah,
had the chops, they had a major label deal, they had Terry Brown producing them. The ingredients were there for a band that could have eventually made a name for themselves. But I think you're right. I think it almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
almost,
It's like, okay, well, in case we don't make it, well, we didn't make it.
right. Yeah, right.
It's
Exactly.
like think it, have something to fall back on, but don't think about it too much. It's like, how
Yeah.
bad do you want it?
And they, in timing, the timing was weird. They, from their record deal, when they signed with Epic, they had all this group of people behind them, and then the record label stuff started changing because CBS ended up getting bought out by Sony, and by the
Sony,
time you got to Time Will Tell, all the people that Fifth Angel had worked with that believed in them, they were gone,
that happens
and
so
so that
much.
happened,
Yeah.
and it was really weird, bad timing. But I think part of it is just they like I said, they were so, we have our plan B, so if it doesn't work, we'll go here. and they didn't take the risks that some other bands may have done in
I,
their
I'm,
place.
I mean, that's better than ending up destitute.
Well, and that was it's a great. I'm glad you said that because I was talking to Ed Archer and he said to me, he goes, I know so many musicians from our era where they're our age now and they're struggling, and he
Yeah,
goes, and I feel terrible for them. He goes, I'm not, because I had a plan B and I love my music, but I had to get on with my life. And he goes, both myself and Ted, we didn't want to be in that boat. And I get that. I absolutely get that. But the the guy who managed Fifth Angel, Derek Simon, great guy. He also managed Dream Theater on their
I was
first
going to say
record.
that
Yeah,
name sounds familiar. Yeah,
yeah, Derek Simon, great guy. Fellow, I'm from New York, so we're two fellow New Yorkers. We were going back and forth with one another for this book. Great guy. But he said, Fifth Angel to me is the band, what could have been. They just had everything going their way, and they just couldn't quite get out of their own way. And that's really the story of Fifth Angel. It's couldn't get out of their own way, came back, did a couple more records, and now it's almost the same thing. They could get out now and play festivals and do club tours and do all this kind of stuff, but they're in their 60s. Do they really want to get out there and do that anymore and sit on a bus for forever? No. And I don't blame them.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's just very weird timing, and yeah, it's an interesting story for sure because they were talented,
yeah.
really talented.
It's quite something, and I don't think people realize just how much you're asking of people to do that because they're not in their 20s anymore, and maybe they just don't. They said, look, we'd love to play for fans, but we don't have the luxury of having a really nice bus, or we can't,
Yeah.
it would be a grind, and yeah, a lot of people, but you know what? You do, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I read an interview with Don Dokken, and I think this dates back to probably 95 when they put Dysfunctional out and the
Love that
original.
record.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too, me too. For a brief period, things were looking up. But he said a lot of the guys that were in bands from the 80s that I know, I don't know what they were thinking. He's like, they've got gold records on the wall, but they're broke. And
Yeah.
not only are they broke, they're in debt, like hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt
Yeah.
because there's, the word recoupable. You got to understand that stuff. You got to understand what it means. They don't own their publishing. They don't own, even if you have a hit single, I mean, all you have to do is look at the fragmented bands that were out there. I mean, I don't want to pick on them because I like the band, but look at Great White. Let's
Oh
not,
yeah.
forget about the fire. That was terrible. But, you know, their biggest hit single was a cover. And they never, they had two platinum albums, but that they're not they're not a band that stayed in the zeitgeist. They weren't able to keep going, and grunge did a number on them, and um but you see these guys now, it's like, yeah, I mean, if you think about it, if there's anybody that's in a band that you used to like and you haven't heard tell of them in a long time, unfortunately chances are good they've fallen on hard times.
Yeah. That's really accurate. And I know Ted and Ed from Fifth Angel, they didn't want to be that way. And
Yeah,
they had some foresight for sure. I mean, but I would definitely say Fifth Angel is one of those bands. What could have been? They should have been on the level of a Queensryche. That kind of level of success, the talent is there.
yeah,
You mentioned before that those vocal star ads with Ted Pilot. Well, Jeff Tate did those with him. It was
yeah.
actually, I cover that in the book. The two of them did these cassette tape vocal lessons. There's a lot of parallels of talent, there, and they couldn't accomplish it. And Queensryche, they didn't have a plan B either. So
No,
they
yeah,
they were so I think that has a lot to do with it. But Fifth Angel went out once they got reunited again. Tim, I'll be honest with you. Their third record, they're called The Third Secret. Kendall Bechtel, who was their lead guitar player after James Bird on Time Will Tell, he stepped up and did lead vocals on The Third Secret. And if you haven't heard that record, I encourage you to cue it up and listen to it. He's wonderful as a lead singer. He's wonderful, and the album's really good.
That
Um,
is so rare for, like that's almost like uh Phil Collins stepping out from behind the drums to replace Peter Gabriel in Genesis on
yeah,
vocals. Like to have someone else in your band that's that good at another skill set.
yeah. And you know what? The funny thing was, and I'll share a little story. Back in 2010, when Fifth Angel got back together, they were about a couple weeks prior to playing their first gig in Germany, and they were having singer issues. The singer that they had chosen had some issues with his voice and couldn't sing. And they were without a singer. And I was working with them at the time. And I went up to Ed's house and I rehearsed with them and I sang a bunch of songs. And I had known Kendall could sing. You know, my 5 minutes of fame with Fifth Angel, I wasn't ready. But I knew Kendall could sing. And I said to him, like, why aren't you singing? He's like, oh, I couldn't do that. And Kendall Bechtel has done a lot of solo records and he sings on all of his stuff. And so I knew he could do it. And I just think they took a while for him to just say, okay, fine, I'll do it. And, you know, a lot of credit's got to be given to Kendall Bechtel for The Third Secret and Ken Mary, who also pushed him forward. Hey, you can do this. What he pulled out some great vocal performances from Kendall on that record. And you know, and shout out to Ken Mary too. When they play live, Ken Mary's singing a lot of the high harmony parts. Um,
Yeah.
People don't know that, but Ken throws the headset mic on, and he's hitting stratospheric notes up there. So
He's
it's
doing like the Chris DeGarmo
kind
kind
of,
of
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah. So he's providing it. So it, you know, but The Third Secret was a great record. If people who know Fifth Angel, it's really kind of a middle ground between the first Fifth Angel record and Time Will Tell. They kind of found a little middle ground happy place for that album, and it sounds great. It sounds like Fifth Angel with a little more of a Dio-esque singer as opposed to a Dawkins singer.
Do you think maybe if they'd started 2 or 3 years earlier that they could have gotten a more of a foothold?
Maybe. Seattle was such a weird place in the late 70s, right? You
Right.
have to remember that too, where because nowadays it really doesn't matter where you are because of the internet and because of
Right.
things
It
and home
wasn't it
studios.
wasn't a huge center of, I mean,
No,
other than Heart.
it was Jimi Hendrix, Hart, and then eventually TKO got a deal for a brief
Yeah,
year on a major.
that's right.
Um, but then the next thing you know, it was Queensryche, and
Yeah.
then they got it, and that was 80. They got their deal in 83, and then
Hmm.
Fifth Angel got their deal in 86, and I think Metal Church got theirs in 85.
Oh, Metal Church, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I forgot they were
So,
from there.
but I mean, there was a hotbed. Everybody thinks about Seattle, and you think about that whole grunge movement, and I love a lot of those bands. Soundgarden, Alice in Chains for me are great, but there's a whole host of hard rock and metal bands that grew up in that late 70s, early 80s that in Seattle, and they had so much talent, and they just never quite got the notoriety, and nobody really paid attention really until Queensryche, and
Yeah,
and and I think Queensryche in some ways, they ended up getting eyes on Seattle, and then grunge started. I really give.
that's yeah,
People don't talk about that, but I really think if there was no Queensryche, I don't think eyeballs would have been on Nirvana and Pearl Jam and all of
right.
those. The eyeballs were there because Queensryche was so successful.
Yeah.
Uh,
Be like, wait a minute, where are these guys from?
yeah.
Yeah.
And Fifth
What?
Angel, Fifth Angel was a part of that too. You know, Queensryche got their deal. There, people are sniffing around Seattle in 85, 86, and there was Metal Church and Fifth Angel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, two very cool books out there, and not and what I like is that they're not on the average subject. I think that's fantastic. So, for the sake of supposing, Jason Slater book and Wings of Destiny, the Fifth Angel story. Where can people get the Fifth Angel book? Is that also on Amazon, or is that?
Yeah, I've been trying to put everything. You can get it at Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can get it. You can order it from anywhere. But I really try to focus on the Amazon because I feel like that's where more people will go to grab something, just out of convenience sake. But you can
Amen.
get them
I know.
anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know you know.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, they both can be purchased there. And yeah, the Fifth Angel book was a labor of love. I've known those guys for years, and I've really enjoyed writing the story. And it's a quite a roller coaster ride. It's not your typical band. It's a band biography, but they have quite a colorful story for a band that never really hit the mountaintop.
That's awesome. So check those out, folks, if you're into any of the artists we've talked about. And Brian, I want to thank you again for doing this, and thanks for I think that all of us. I'll throw Martin Popoff into the conversation too. People will be these bands will be forgotten if they're not written about, and it's just a little bit of it's preserving that. It's all part of music history, and so yeah. So thanks for coming on to talk about them. Best of luck with the books, and yeah, it's great that a band like Fifth Angel is getting the right treatment, and Jason Slater is someone that needed his story told, and no one better to do it. So, and there's no one better to do any of these about it as somebody that's got passion for it. Like, I've had people come to me and say, why don't you do a book about X band? You're like, look, I like them, but I have no interest in doing a book about them. Therefore, it doesn't make sense for me to do it, and you could tell it would sound like I was going through the motions. So,
Absolutely. I
yeah,
totally understand where you're coming from.
yeah,
Yeah.
we it has to make sense for better or worse. It has to make
Mhm.
sense. So, author Brian Heaton, check out his books on Amazon. I will post a link to them below, and I'll also have at the end of this, I'll have our previous interview about his excellent Roads to Madness book. And Brian, thanks for doing this. Thanks for
Tim,
coming
thank
on.
you. I appreciate it very much, and continued success with your own work. Love it. And let's hope that Fleetwood Mac book does great for you, because I'm
Uh,
really looking forward to reading it.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching this edition of Tim's Final Confessions. Go read a good book. List of some good bands. We'll see you.